Hey everyone, and welcome to Pathfinder, a podcast by Payload, the leading digital media company in the space industry. My guests today are Will Bruey, CEO and co-founder of Varda, and Delian Asparouhov, co-founder and president. Varda is an in-space manufacturing and hypersonic Earth re-entry logistics company based out of El Segundo, California. The company not only just raised $90 million in Series B funding, but also just completed its first mission, where it successfully brought back from orbit its capsule containing the discovery of a third form of the HIV drug ritonavir. We get into all this, the company's origin story and business model, but first, a word from our sponsors. This year, the Italian trade agency showed up in full force at the National Space Symposium in Colorado Springs. They exhibited 12 groundbreaking companies showcasing their technologies all under one roof. From aerospace giants to pioneering startups, the Italian pavilion this year represented a diverse spectrum of expertise and creativity, combining tradition and innovation. Moreover, this year saw the largest Italian delegation the conference has ever seen in attendance. For more information about what the ITA is doing for the global space community, be sure to check out their website at www.itahouston.com. Delian, Will, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
So let's jump right in. Tell us a little bit about how you guys got started. You guys have some different backgrounds. How did you guys come together? What was the Varda origin story?
I've been thinking about this idea around the industrialization of space and sort of in-space manufacturing for a really long time. And originally, Varda actually kind of started as an investment thesis, where in Q4 2019, for the first time, a Falcon 9 rocket basically launched and landed 4 or 5 times in a row. And a bunch of my old sort of friends from MIT had gone off to work at SpaceX, and so I kind of pinged a couple of them and I was like, "Hey, how does the wear and tear look? Is this something that can now launch and land 40 times? How's Starship coming along?" And the resounding feedback was like, reusable rockets are here. We're going to be able to fly these a lot. And Starship is also sort of on track. It's not going to launch next year, but it'll definitely sort of happen. And so as an investor, I immediately took that as like, okay, there is now a whole sort of set of business models that are enabled by reusable rockets. And the one that I thought had the most sort of promise was sort of in-space manufacturing in low Earth orbit, but for things that are basically brought back down here to Earth, right? Not, in-space manufacturing sort of for space. And so I originally approached like 40 or 50 different, sort of research groups, venture-backed founders, companies, et cetera, that were, sort of focusing on this problem set, but ultimately came away realizing that I didn't think anybody had the right vision. Mostly just people weren't focused on bringing actual products to market that had real customer value. And most people were only operating within the confines of the International Space Station. And even though my background isn't like an aerospace engineering, just for a first principles basis, it seemed pretty obvious that like a human rated government run station was not going to be the place this type of activity happened. And so I kind of put the idea on the shelf and COVID hits. Peter Thiel at the time told the firm to take it a little lighter on sort of investing. And so I had a lot of free time and I was like, let me go re-explore this idea. And one of the things that everybody was sort of most terrified of, this sort of architecture that I was proposing that was independent of the ISS, was who's going to bring you back down? Like, what's your ride down? And so I admit that was not a problem that I necessarily knew how to solve, but I was like, but I have a lot of friends from MIT that worked on Dragon. So what if I just go start chatting with people on the Dragon team and just kind of like pitching them on the idea and seeing if I like resonate with the right person and find the right co-founder. And so I think it was like August 21st, 2020. Got introduced to Bruey as one of the guys that I really needed to chat with about this idea. And I don't know, Bruey, you can take it away from there.
Will, does that check out?
Yeah. Yeah, that checks at least. That checks out. So I was, I worked at SpaceX, so I kind of was at the profile that Delian was looking at for, I think, and the fact that I worked on Dragon, but also had started small companies before and knew a little bit about business, was such that it wasn't the first time I saw a safe or anything like that. So I had kind of the two boxes to check, and then when Delian reached out, I was looking to do a startup anyway. And I booked the flights immediately before he could recomp me from Founders Fund. It was super exciting. So I flew to California, met Delian, and we kind of hit it off. We kind of had the same vision, the same principles for how we wanted to start and build this company, and it's been the adventure of a lifetime ever since.
Did you know who Delian was beforehand, or was this like some guy reached out and you were like, "Who is this guy? Like, is he legit?" Did you know anything about him?
No, I had never heard of him before. I had heard of Founders Fund, and I had heard of Peter Thiel, and So I knew that it was, a serious discussion. It wasn't just some Joe Schmo off the street, but no, it was like a blind date.
We did have a lot of mutual friends though, where it's like, several of my very closest friends from MIT had actually worked with Bruey, sort of at SpaceX. So it wasn't like totally two strangers off the, sort of street. But yeah, we hadn't never sort of really, met before or heard of each other. But it was one of these things where there was like a lot of, let's say, like mutual, shared, sort of trust and understanding because we had so many mutual, sort of connections.
Yeah, that's great. So what are you guys building? So how was that sort of initial meeting? How did that initial meeting go between you guys, and like where is the company at today?
Yeah, so Delian's idea was, how can we manufacture in space, and could you build a small dragon? And at first I thought to myself, no, but why do we need such a complex vehicle if we're only bringing down inanimate objects? And then I thought about the Corona film bucket, which was the first reentry vehicle that humans ever flew back in the 60s. And thought that was a great system architecture as a role model for what we wanted to do. We wanted to produce relatively simple materials in orbit and bring them back as cheaply and as quickly as possible. And when I realized that, part of the company's ethos is to cut scope, romanticize the simplicity, see the elegance in simple engineering, and that was what we saw in the Corona film bucket, and it kind of kicked off the North Star of what we wanted to build. Could we do that for the modern age at scale now with reusable rockets, making it economical?
And I think at the time, we had some, let's say, pre-existing notions on what we thought the potential materials sort of should be. There's a decent amount of basically pre-existing data sets from the International Space Station. We started to sort of dig into those, but a lot of the sort of company focus was, let's start building the space architecture that we think is the sort of cost-effective way. And gravity is such a sort of fundamental, right? It's one of the four fundamental forces of physics that we may not have the exact sort of business model, material, et cetera, selected. But even in our very first seed stage deck, we basically articulated here are the sort of 4 or 5 sort of use cases that we're thinking about. It'll take us some time to sort of burn these down and figure out which one is the sort of ultimate one. But it'll also take us some time to sort of build out this aerospace architecture as well. And so let us start. And I think one of the things that we sort of realized pretty early on was a lot of the, let's say, sort of white papers that were funded by NASA were, sort of more, sort of scientific marketing and propaganda than they were, sort of really reflective of the, sort of real world customer case. And so it definitely took some navigation to find what is the exact angle, the customer value proposition, the business model that, ultimately, sort of ends up, sort of closing. But, it's not like we needed to figure that out in like 3 months and, go to launch. Obviously, it was going to take us, 2 years and 5 months to get to launch. And so we had some time to basically, sort of work through what turned out to be basically just like a lot of customer, sort of interviews and a lot of, sort of scientific, groundwork.
All right. So let's take a quick step back. So I want to ask sort of a question that I get often actually when microgravity or manufacturing in space comes up, which is why even do it? What's the point of manufacturing microgravity? Yeah, so what advantages does microgravity offer over kind of traditional or Earth-based manufacturing?
Totally. Yeah. Gravity is a fundamental force of physics. And so it's static on Earth, locked at 1G or on Earth. But if you can change that, all of engineering is built on the fundamental forces of physics. So we are interested in, well, what can we do if we can change gravity as a parameter? And the killer app is pharmaceuticals for a couple of reasons. One is it's a large market here on Earth, and 2 is dollars per kilogram warrant the trip to space. So we're able to impact drug formulas by introducing gravity as a new parameter.
And the way that gravity actually affects these sort of chemical systems is gravity is the fundamental cause of a significant amount of the basically transport systems and forces that affect how a chemical system reacts. So one of the sort of simplest analogies that we sometimes like to use is that if you basically put a glass a cube of ice into a glass of water, that it basically floats up to the top. The reason is because water, when it forms into that crystalline structure of ice, actually the molecules of water become further apart from one another relative to when it's in liquid form. So it becomes becomes less dense. And so a less dense, basically, sort of solid rises to the top inside of that liquid. If you would instead put ice, inside of, a glass of water in microgravity, that ice would just basically float around just inside of that, sort of water. Another one that you're probably familiar from the kitchen is like oil and vinegar, right? The reason that they separate is because they have these varying densities. So imagine that in order to create a next generation pharmaceutical product, one of the requirements was you needed to have a drug reactor that was, let's say, the size of a milk gallon jug, and you needed to be able to hold a very homogeneous solution of both oil and vinegar perfectly mixed and keep it perfectly still for 3 days on end. Literally, that very simple chemical reaction that I've just described to you is actually completely impossible to do down here on Earth because, again, gravity will basically constantly force this separation of different densities of liquids versus the moment that you remove gravity from the equation, you no longer have those basically density-driven basically forces. And so that has huge effects, as Bruey mentioned, in pharmaceuticals, but across any really sensitive materials, fiber optics, semiconductors. It has a sort of lot of potential applications even within the world of pharmaceuticals because as you can imagine, these density-driven forces can have a wide set of effects on pharma products. And by the way, it's not always guaranteed that removing gravity makes it better. There are times where actually removing gravity makes it worse. But what it really does is just opens the Overton window of what is possible in terms of a chemical system because you remove one of these sort of chaotic inducing factors. Because if you did want to separate the like oil and vinegar, great, run it through a centrifuge and you can have it separate the oil and vinegar, right? So you basically have the opportunity to remove certain effects if you want to, and that has a ton of advantages.
And you could tie that to so it's such a broad technology, but you can tie that to something specific in the case of something like Keytruda, which is the highest revenue drug that Merck flew on the International Space Station. And they showed that the particle size distribution, all the crystal sizes, are they all big or are they all small or are they all the same size? That size distribution changes as a function of gravity. And that can mean the difference between an IV bag or a shot as the formula for that drug. So if you imagine a chemotherapy administered via shot instead of an IV bag, that's the same medicine, but a whole different patient experience.
How did you build the business case around this? Because what I want to ask about is one of the things that we see a lot of is a lot of products in search, or I should say a solution in search of a problem, right? Was at any point, when you were building Varda, did it feel like that? Or did from day one, were you saying like, hey, we're building a pioneering startup in this space, but we know that if we can get this right, there's going to be demand for this?
I think in the pharmaceutical world, it was clear that top 20 biopharma had shown that they had interest in this, not just as a technology, but because of the problems that it could solve, given the amount of effort that they were putting into actually running these types of experiments on the ISS. And so I think in the transition from architecture and sort of product into ultimately being focused on the sort of solutions that we could provide customers. A lot of that was just sort of studying the pharmaceutical field, studying the sort of work from top 20 biopharma and the ISS, understanding what would commercialization look like. And so maybe to sort of take a step back, especially given that this sort of audience of this podcast is a little bit more aerospace focused, and Varda really is fundamentally a pharmaceutical company. I think it'll be helpful to just run through what is the timeline and how does a basically pharmaceutical sort of product get developed. So there's a couple different stages to developing a product. There's that initial basically synthesis or discovery stage, right, where you are deciding here's the particular therapeutic area that I want to tackle, here's the method of action that I'm trying to affect, and then ultimately here is the drug that I have synthesized that now actually affects that method of action the way that I want. And that's where you hear terms like AI drug discovery. That's where if you took an organic chemistry class in sort of college, that's a lot of what that type of work sort of looks like. The next step in basically bringing a drug to market is what's known as formulation and development. That's basically where you go from that individual drug molecule to instead something that is a sort of packaged up and more stable form. Because if you think about that, like let's say in the world of what are known as small molecules, these organic compounds, if you just left like a singular large hydrocarbon chain, sort of sitting on the shelf of a pharmacy, it actually has a very short shelf life. You need to actually put it into a like packaged up basically form or formulation that allows it to actually both be manufactured at scale and also be delivered to patients in a particular form factor. And then again, that can be an IV drip, a gel tablet, a capsule, a syringe. There's a ton of different sort of form factors that the particular sort of drug can take. And then come basically the sort of clinical trials, which are with a limited number number of patients, and then obviously, mass manufacturing and commercialization. And so where Varda lives within is basically around this, process of formulation, partially because gravity, in theory might have effects in synthesis, but really there Brownian motion mostly dominates. So that's basically the random jiggling of atoms. Versus as you get into the world of these more sort of macromolecular, basically chemical systems like formulation, that's where really gravity starts to, sort of dominate much more so than Brownian motion. And what gravity allows you to do is develop basically net new formulations that may significantly affect the drug product's basically performance characteristics to a patient, but also its manufacturability. And now we're not the only company that is developing technology that improves these formulations. There's actually multiple, very large companies publicly traded on the NASDAQ that explicitly have business models focused around formulation technologies. And so I'll pick one of my favorites that is an interesting example to go through. That is this company called Halozyme down in San Diego. They came out with this technology that was basically this, sort of appending of an enzyme to a particular drug that basically improves the basically solubility of a drug, basically how much it breaks down in their bloodstream. The way that they commercialize their technology is they don't go out and actually develop drug products themselves. They go and find basically large biopharma companies that have a drug product that has a particular solubility issue. Basically, it's not breaking down in patients' bloodstreams. They attach their enzyme technology to the drug, and then together that drug product is now brought to market where it's the drug molecule that has the effect that the pharma company wants and this company's enzyme basically user technologies. And the way that they monetize that is they have a combination of both milestones that they get paid as they show that their technology has the effect that the customer wants, but they also become basically strategic partners in the development of the drug where they actually get royalties and basically long-term, think of it as like drug equities effectively. So when you think about Varda's business model, it's effectively identical. We have, sort of top 20 biopharma as well as mid-stage biotech that we, sort of partner with that give us a particular drug molecule that they know has the method of action, has the therapeutic benefits that they want, but is suffering due to some, sort of formulation issue. And that may be it is completely insoluble in patients' bloodstreams. It's incredibly difficult to manufacture and is, let's say, hypersensitive to humidity and is constantly uptaking water in a way that destroys the product, right? There's a lot of different types of formulation challenges. And we basically assess, can microgravity be the effective solution to that? And then if so, we contract in the exact same structure that a company like Halozyme does, where it's these basically, sort of success-driven milestones. And so, I'd argue, yes, when we first started the company, we definitely started with the architecture. And I admit that it was, gravity is one of these, sort of horizontally applicable technologies that will ultimately find the way to commercialize it. But now when you look at some of our customer contracts, they could care less about the technology. They don't even think about, microgravity, aerospace at all. All of that in some ways is like a rounding error. They have a particular drug product. They have an issue with that drug product that's preventing it from coming to market, and Varda is there to basically solve it. And we get, sort of paid in this unique, sort of royalty milestone structure. We actually get to participate in the upside of the drugs that we work on. And by the way, that model of, again, formulation improvements, not one that we, had to invent. It's one that, sort of public market investors have clearly shown a willingness and interest to sort of back and get involved in. And so that's where, to our customers, we appear to just be a pharmaceutical formulation business. The fact that we have a bunch of SpaceX engineers, in El Segundo launching spacecraft is actually mostly a rounding error to them. If we just had a zero gravity chamber in the back of our lab, they would be perfectly happy with that.
What are there any formulations or what I should say, any drugs that have novel drugs or molecules that have been improved upon or built in space so far that has then gone to commercialization? Has that sort of happened yet before Varda?
No, because there has been very.
I was going to say there's no commercial off ramp for the research done at the on the ISS National Lab, right? So that's actually the best. That question is the warrant for having a Varda as the commercial off ramp for all that great research that's been done. You just can't do it commercially with the ISS.
Yeah, tons of interesting promise and data sets that have shown potential for commercialization. But yeah, with the moment you have humans in space and the government, that's just not something that can be integrated into your commercial supply chain. You can do a one-off small experiment of demonstration, but good luck doing that regularly, doing it every single month if you need to. And by the way, NASA forces you to, publish basically all your IP and they co-own it. No pharmaceutical company wants their most important value proposition, their IP, to be owned by the government.
Right. Well, I have a number of questions on tech and scale, but before we get to that, I do have to ask, whatever happened to ZBLAN? So for a while there, everyone was talking. Yeah. Not just you guys. Everyone was talking about ZBLAN, and then no one's now talking about ZBLAN.
So ZBLAN was a great first product, I think, for Varda when we were 12 people, because what we wanted to do is we wanted to show that we could create value in microgravity, but we weren't good at doing business development, certainly not with the long sales cycle of pharma. So we thought, well, we're engineers. It's a harder engineering challenge to do fiber in space, but we could do that. And the second it comes back, you just sell the fiber as a commodity. So our plan was start that as our first product and use that to prove that we can create revenue in space. And then we'll raise a round to go into pharma. We got lucky, quite frankly, in that the vehicle that we built to do that was also ideal for a hypersonic testbed for the Air Force. And so the Air Force purchased a couple of missions for us, and the revenue from those missions was as large as the whole TAM market size of ZBLAN. So we said, okay, instead of ZBLAN being the lily pad on the way to pharma, we'll have hypersonic testbed be that. And so we kind of did a remove and replace. And so now we have that line of business in addition to our pharmaceutical line of business for the upside.
So you're a pharma defense company, basically. The first of its
We're
kind.
definitely the only company that has pharmaceutical scientists and hypersonic engineers under one roof. That I can definitely guarantee you.
That's right.
So let's talk tech. What have you guys developed internally to facilitate space manufacturing? Like, what is how much of the tech that you've built so far? And I know you guys just did a mission. We'll talk about that in a second. But how much of it has been internally developed R&D versus like off the shelf?
Yeah, so it goes back to what Delian said as the North Star, which is we want to be a formulation company that provides new formulas to pharmaceutical companies. And so we start when we intake the drugs with a formulation challenge. We first see how they behave with gravity, and so we have a centrifuge in the lab where we can turn gravity from 1 to 5. You can of course go higher in gravity on Earth, but not lower. And so we can at least see the sensitivity of the molecule and the chemical system as a whole to gravity. So that helps inform us of, do we have a shot at making a significant impact to the formulation in microgravity? Then where gravity plays a role in microgravity is when the molecule goes from in solution to the solid state. And so there's a few ways you can do that. Melting and cooling ice is an easy example. You can also do it chemically by what's called an anti-solvent, which is a third-party molecule or solution that comes in and supersaturates the drug out into the solid state. And so, but we have to build those in-house because that type of hardware does exist on the ground, but it's not built for space. It's not built to work properly in microgravity. And so a lot of our IP, if you will, and the innovation that takes place at Varda is in that pharmaceutical payload manufacturing apparatus that lives in our vehicle.
So you guys just had a pretty, what seems like successful mission, W1. Tell us a little bit about W1. What happened?
Yeah, it was, speaking of the adventure of a lifetime, what a mission. So we launched it in June. It was supposed to come back in August. We had to facilitate a little bit more regulatory activity between multiple government entities, everyone from our Air Force customer to a different branch of the Air Force where our landing site was, to the FAA, new regulation in Part 450, first time a commercial company has ever used has a reentry license under 450, and we're landing on land. So, I told the team, if you don't see this type of friction from what you're doing, then you're not pushing the envelope. Like, the envelope is very heavy. And so we found out that it was nice and heavy in August, and to push that part of the envelope. Once we got to yes on all those parties and showed, facilitated across all those government entities, we got the go ahead to land, and then had a reentry that was the most exciting, thrilling 3-day deorbit maneuver that I've certainly ever been a part of. It made, like if you watch Apollo 13, my blood pressure would go down. It seemed like a coming of age road trip movie, rom-com situation in comparison. But yeah, we pulled it off. Super proud of the team. Everyone was ecstatic. We all watched it from in the main area of the company. We're popping bottles of champagne. Shaking the colonel's hand. There was a few tears shed and watery eyes from each of the engineers. During the reentry, I to keep the mood light, I'd go over to each responsible engineer whose hardware was performing at that time. Like, oh man, I hope that heat shield really holds up. Like, what do you think? And they're like sweating bullets, as we're in blackout, and
That's mean.
literally like holding a pillow like it's a teddy bear. And then, oh man, I hope that parachute. Remember that time the parachute didn't open? I hope that doesn't happen this time. Keeping it light, but yeah, everything worked. The second we got the go ahead, I think my wife actually said it best. I was like, oh shoot, now we actually have to do this thing. We had to fill out all this paperwork and this facilitation. And she was like, don't worry, this is what you built the team for. Like I was like, oh right, this is like our natural motion. Like it's like we were Michael Jordan playing baseball for a couple of years, and all of a sudden we're back on the basketball court. And of course it went off, smoothly and without a hitch. And I'm sure you saw the reentry video, which I've definitely watched, anywhere between 100 and 200 times. But man, was it beautiful.
And then I think what's super exciting is beyond... Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say 100 to 200 times for you as well.
yeah, exactly. Definitely. Yeah, especially
I sent it to my barber. I would show that video to anyone who would look at it, man. I was like, hey, are you free for a haircut 6 p.m.? By the way, check out this video.
Check out what we did.
Yeah.
But I was going to say, beyond just the successful, I think reentry, one of our sort of stretch goals of the first mission was to basically demonstrate pharmaceutical processing even on the very first mission, not to create some sort of net new differentiated product, but basically show that we could both do extremely precise pharmaceutical work in microgravity on the very first flight. And we took a handful of control vials of a variety of different forms of pharmaceutical product and show that those sort of pharmaceutical products stayed perfectly stable through launch, through microgravity, through reentry. Given that I think the two of the biggest questions that we basically would get from customers is, great, we see a ton of potential in microgravity, but one, can you actually process these things with the same level of precision that you can down here on Earth? We absolutely prove that. And two, does launch, low Earth orbit, radiation, reentry, et cetera, somehow fundamentally affect the sort of structure of the drug product? We now should publicly publish a preprint of our sort of scientific paper of those results that was sort of perfectly outstanding. We were able to manufacture all 3 different forms of ritonavir, including sort of the most unstable form, and take up 4 different control vials, including the amorphous solid version of ritonavir, which is incredibly unstable. And again, that stayed in that exact same form.
We kept it on orbit on ice for 8 months, kept it in that state. And then when we brought it back and took it to the lab, the worst environments it saw coming from Leo to the lab was the FedEx truck. It like our reentry vehicle, the payload stayed cool as a cucumber at max soakback temp. It got up to room temp. So, all the questions of like, oh man, how are you going to bring drugs from space to Earth? Here's the data.
Was this
especially for pharma customers, they just care so much about just data sets, right? So that's why you may have seen we've just gotten much more proactive about. We also recently published this like hypergravity paper around just like how to screen basically gravity sensitivity in small molecule compounds. Obviously, this first flight, sort of data set, and so you'll see Varda now consistently publish scientific papers, with obviously some flights we may have customers on board that are unwilling to let us publish anything, but whenever possible, we will be continuing to publish more data sets, given that is what our pharmaceutical customers really index off of the most.
What was this a revenue generating mission?
The goal of this mission was not to, do any type of, sort of revenue generation when we first designed it. And the pharmaceutical product is one that we ultimately selected as a demonstration, sort of molecule because it had a lot of very interesting solid state characteristics. Basically, ritonavir is this, the first ever HIV antiviral that in the mid 90s actually got recalled off the market due to solid state crystallization challenges. And so in theory, if Varda had been around in the mid 90s, we could have potentially helped, sort of ritonavir basically stay on the market. That was why we chose the drug product. We ultimately did end up making revenue off of this drug from some of our government customers in relation to that sort of hypersonic reentry sort of test bed line of business, where we actually delivered both some heat shield billets as well as some data from that sort of first flight, both the Air Force to NASA. But all those sort of contracts and all that revenue actually happened way after we had already basically designed the vehicle with the original intention of being purely a demonstration mission. So it was not an expectation that we would make revenue, but it obviously is really great that we sort of did manage to squeeze some in. And then future flights will be the first time that we actually start to now actually fly customer pharmaceutical product, rather than our own in-house selections.
What is this? What does the success of this mission mean for commercial traction? Like, have you guys had like companies on the sideline just waiting to see how this would go before they sign, on the dotted line? Like, how's that looking right now?
Yeah, it shows the system end to end. We were able to put a vehicle into orbit, crystallize a drug into a very specific stable state, and then bring it back and analyze it in the lab. So that answered all the kind of, hey, can you do this from a technical perspective questions from pharma? And, Delian, jump in here with the business model, but it's kind of when they win, we win. And so, once the technology is proven, the barrier to entry is drastically reduced.
Yeah, there's been both across sort of pharmaceutical customers that had some questions and doubt of, again, ability to process independent of an International Space Station. Does it for some reason require humans? Dragon is this incredibly complex vehicle. Yes, that can keep humans and drug products safe, but can something like yours that is much more cost effective and high cadence also provide those same capabilities? And then also on the sort of DoD and NASA side of things, right? Just that video that we were referencing earlier of that hypersonic plasma that we generated is exactly what hypersonic engineers are looking to sort of model and generate sort of data from our future flights on. And so, it's been a huge unlock. I think, basically since that first mission, we've been closing a customer contract roughly every 2 or 3 weeks. And so, hopefully can, sort of continue that pace and look forward to the first handful of announcements that we expect to, hopefully go out at call in the next, sort of quarter or so.
Just to kind of double click on the business model, are pharma companies effectively paying you sort of an upfront payment? Like, here's a chunk of dollars, and then if this is successful and then we can turn this into a commercial drug, then you get a percentage royalty. I guess my question is, where's the business risk for you guys lie? Where does most of that risk lie?
Yeah, there's typically sort of two, let's say, sort of types of business models. One is what's known as a, sort of CRO, which is a contract research organization, where you just basically strictly paid, sort of cash up front. You perform research, deliver data to your pharmaceutical customer, but they ultimately fully own that IP. They fully own that data set. They're welcome to do whatever they would, sort of like with it. And definitely a lot of customers have, sort of pushed us, to do that, given that would be their preference. We've held a pretty strong line on this is an extremely sort of strategic platform and technology in a way that enables net new drug products. We want to participate in the upside of what we work on, which is again similar to companies sort of like Halozyme, which again strategic technology and formulation. But to be clear, there are companies that do formulation work, purely fee for service. There's a company, Wuxi, that does about 30-40% of all small molecule formulation in the United States. It's a Chinese company. They have no new technology that they bring to the table. They just do it at the lowest possible, basically, fee and help you, sort of, formulate. So we definitely wanted to go to the Halozyme approach. That definitely introduced some barriers earlier on, and that our customers were actually much more willing to pay millions and millions of dollars up front. They would prefer to do that than, give up some of the upside in the drug product that they, sort of work on, sort of with us. But I think especially as we started to generate data, showed a lot of potential to the platform, we do have the first handful of those types of sort of deals signed where over time they may include some upfront component. If you look at, for example, there's a company in Boston called Electrify that also does this type of sort of formulation. They now, especially on their, I think they're on their 6th or 7th deal now, have gotten some amount of purely upfront in addition to getting to participate in the upside. But typically for a formulation platform, you'll see their first handful of deals is more purely on the upside, some amount of milestones on the way to the drug coming to market. So for example, when you discover a new formulation, when that patent gets filed, when that patent gets approved, when that new formulation actually goes into a patient's sort of bloodstream for the first time. Those are the, we're definitely taking on some business risk ourselves in terms of the sort of drug's long-term potential beyond just the formulation that we're developing. But on the flip side, it's much higher upside where individual drugs that we can work on can represent hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue for Varda. And I think it's important to also touch on one point that we've sort of glossed over so far, which is how does one take the work that we do in microgravity and ultimately commercialize it, right? And I think what most people don't realize is we're not necessarily only talking about having to do mass manufacturing, in space in order to actually commercialize sort of drug products. There's actually, what we think of as sort of 3 separate models of bringing this drug to market. The first is what we call the sort of sourdough starter approach, where you can actually create a basically seed crystal of sort of 1 to 5 grams in orbit. And that particular crystal is metastable enough that you can actually bring it to think of it as like a vat of the drug product that you actually, produce down here on Earth, where you basically just use that seed crystal to then scale up a larger batch down here on Earth. And so you only have to do that initial, basically like formulation, discovery in some ways up in microgravity. But from then on, all the mass manufacturing happens down here on Earth. That definitely is applicable to a significant subset, in particular in the small molecule, market that we're starting off often. The second is what I lightly like to call the analogy, like the 4-minute mile. So, this is the approach that, sort of Merck took with Keytruda, where, I think, Bruey mentioned that they had flown this in 2019. It's their highest revenue generating drug. They'd shown a huge formulation improvement. They ultimately showed this much, narrower distribution of crystalline structure sizes, and then spent the following 5 years actually analyzing. And it's not clear that it was only the microgravity data sets, maybe it was other things, but they are talking about now commercializing a formulation that has the performance characteristics of what that microgravity formulation had. And so basically what you're doing is you now have a solution that has the performance characteristics you want. Now you can take and optimize all your process parameters, all of your manufacturing, all of your experimentation towards this known result, right? The reason I call it the 4-minute mile is like, once you know the 4-minute mile can be run, now it's a lot easier to go run it because you have an N of 1, basically like, sort of proof point. And so now I'm going to go run the 350, sort of mile. And so we think there's potential there. And then for sure, there is going to be a third set of outcomes where you cannot do the seed crystal. You cannot recreate it basically, sort of down here on Earth, even with a known solution. Ultimately, the only way to do batch manufacturing is in orbit. But that's not something that for us is, sort of decades and decades away from being possible. In the 2027 timeframe, the cost of goods of manufacturing inside of our spacecraft is roughly going to line up with the upper, 85th percentile and above, sort of cost of goods for small molecules today. And so call it like 15% of the market are, sort of drugs that we'll be able to ultimately tackle. And I think a part of why that maybe seems very counterintuitive is for a significant set of small molecules and generally drug products, what you manufacture up in orbit is what's known as just the active pharmaceutical ingredient. When you actually take a tablet as a consumer, whether it's the gel capsule or the tablet, it's not like that entire thing is literally just the drug product. It's actually mostly a bunch of protected layers, a bunch of what are known as excipients. And those are the things that actually protect it so that it can actually make it into your stomach, get dissolved at the appropriate rate, and actually get delivered to the portion of your body. And at the end, it's only, sometimes 1% or 0.1% or 0.01% of that actual, tablet or gel capsule you took that is the actual drug product, which is what we need to manufacture. One of my, and this is a bit of an extreme example given that it's mRNA, but if you look at the Pfizer COVID vaccine, that mRNA product they developed, hundreds of millions of doses. But if you look at the active pharmaceutical ingredient, that thing that Varda would actually have to manufacture, the total that you would have to manufacture across those 400 million doses would fill up 2 milk-gallon jugs. And so that type of batch manufacturing, that volume is obviously very doable inside of a spacecraft that's our sort of current size. So we're not going to be doing batch manufacturing of ibuprofen or penicillin or anything like that. But there's also a significant set of drug products that we can do that type of batch manufacturing in not a decade from today, but in 3 years, which by the way is probably roughly the time frame that it would take from if we get a really, sort of great, early, drug development program kicked off today. Well, it'll still take 3 years for clinical trials and everything to go through. And so, that is roughly the same time frame that even it would be needed for us to, do batch manufacturing for our customers.
Yeah. And zooming out, like you can kind of see now from what Delian's saying as far as how the business model works. There's two key concepts, if you zoomed out. One is that we can open up and unlock formulation solutions for drugs with only a few flights. We don't have to go up for every time. And even when we do, we're only doing the active pharmaceutical ingredients. So it's not as intensive from a mass movement perspective. We're just, tip of the iceberg of creating value from atoms in space instead of just photons. Furthermore, the other thing is that because each drug, you're asking about where the risk lies between us and the pharma company, because each drug has a different risk profile, each drug deal, if you will, looks a little bit different from where the milestones are, where the upfront fees are, and where the royalties are. And so what you see Varda's business model become is also a diversified portfolio of assets moving through. And so when you zoom out, you see a formulation company like a Halozyme, and you're like, oh, behind the curtain there, what are they doing? Oh, they're going to space. But when I look, the customer does not particularly care that we are. So it starts to look like it's just a traditional formulation platform.
There can't be too many companies that are doing this, right?
There's people that talk about obviously like in-space manufacturing more broadly. I would argue, I don't think there's really anybody doing this like fully end-to-end, where I think a part of what makes Varda work is we have everything from obviously, aerospace engineers to pharmaceutical scientists to people that have actually closed these types of strategic, pharmaceutical, sort of development deals. Again, it's because we need to make it to our, make it seem to our customers that they're just interacting with a pharma company. I think a lot of the prior attempts on like in-space manufacturing have always been just like aerospace people that expect that they'll just like fly payloads on behalf of their customers. But like a top 20 biopharma company has no idea how to build a payload. They have no interest in building payloads. Like they buy and sell and license pharmaceutical products. Like that is their sort of bread and butter. And so you need to sort of speak their language. So yes, in theory, I could name a whole set of companies that have like thought about in space manufacturing. Maybe they've even flown payloads to the International Space Station. But I find most of these things to either be sort of research scientific propaganda basically funded by sort of state governments, or they're just sort of PDF presentations that have never flown anything, and both have their sort of deficiencies. We're the only ones that both I think understand our end customers and how to interface with them, and actually know how to fly things to space. And ultimately you kind of need both in one roof. And I would argue again, we're the only place where pharmaceutical scientists and hypersonic engineers are under the same roof.
Are there any types, and obviously you don't have to give me names, but are there any types of like collaborations or partnerships that you guys see that you see yourself pursuing in the future, like a partnership with a pharma company, a partnership with just some type of larger entity that could help you do XYZ better or faster?
Yeah, I think there's two types. One is just like if you look at the end customers and the contracts that we're sort of signing, they do look more in some ways like joint ventures or partnerships than an enterprise SaaS contract, right? You're talking about we have XYZ programs. We might even start to down the line start to consider, okay, we believe in this asset so much because we know that microgravity will be the enabler. We're actually willing to basically split the cost of the clinical trials in exchange for more upside in the drug compound. And so there'll be some subset that is basically like other basically pharmaceutical basically developers, likely top 20 biopharma, but over time, may go more broad. Several of those, by the way, we already sort of have signed, but sort of can't announce yet. There also may be a set that I sort of called like our sort of channel partners. One example might be, and again, we're not going to sign it with Wuxi in particular, but let's say people that are doing the type of work that Wuxi does, where they do traditional terrestrial formulation screening, purely fee for service. You may want to partner with somebody like that, where they go to the pharma customers and they say, hey, fee for service, we'll screen everything that's possible down here on Earth. But then, by the way, if you don't get the solution that you want down here on Earth, here's our partnership with Varda, where once you basically figured out, do you have a low cost Earth-based solution? If not, great, then we'll partner with Varda and actually have them go do the more complex solution, but ultimately allows you to sort of get to market. And so definitely something that we're that part we're very early on in. I always sort of as an investor tell companies you got to figure out your own direct basically sales strategy first before you start to think about sort of any partnerships. And then in the long term, obviously as we start to operate larger and larger aerospace infrastructure, I do get excited by some of the other developments in the space where while we don't have humans in our spacecraft today, one day we may have large enough automated biomanufacturing facilities that even the best automated facilities down here on Earth still require some amount of human visiting and maintenance. And so I do hope that one day we are able to partner with some of these human rated platforms to allow them to come near us, dock potentially, to perform some level of maintenance. Maybe one day there's people that are refueling our space factories or bringing us raw materials for our manufacturing, right? I do get excited by that sort of future potential. For now, we kind of have to do everything fully full stack ourselves because it's the only way to really ensure success, including on the sort of pharmaceutical side. But over time, I hope that we can both open what we've developed to other sort of parties. So maybe one day if somebody does want to go pursue ZBLAN, great, they can go be the fiber optic company, understand that we're happy to host them on our autonomous platforms with power, and maybe we have some forward deploy engineers that know the complex mechanisms and things like that. But again, all of those I'd say are much more in the long term. In the short term, we got to make drugs, we got to make them real good, and we got to find partners that are want to work on drugs with us.
What did you learn through the FAA process?
Wow, so much. Let's see. I learned the percentage of houses that have wood roofs in Idaho. Everything from now. I'll tell you. So I'll summarize what's. You know what? It's almost like Stockholm syndrome because I actually really like it now. Like I was actually looking at at some of the other reentry engineers here and reg engineers, and was like, man, I could definitely see myself as a reg engineer. It's very appealing because there's a lot of math. I was never really good at the applied version of engineering. And so, or not as good, I should say. And so, it's just very fascinating. And so the way I think about Part 450 is if you got pulled over by a police officer driving down the road, they might say, hey, prove that you're going, that your speed is safe. but prove it from first principles. All right. So you're like, all right, well, let's see, how many kids are at this neighborhood? What is the turning radius of the car and the curves of this road? What's the weather right now? What's my reaction time? What was my last medical evaluation? And put together a first like that super duper low level worth of detail to prove that whatever speed that I'm going is safe. And man, I would just love a speed limit because that's just way easier to drive to. But that's kind of what it is right now. And that's kind of, and it makes sense, right? Because we are, essentially the first of its kind, and aerospace in general is a very nascent industry in general compared to what it can be. And so we quite frankly don't know what speed limits should be in this new road. And so we have to kind of derive them each and every time. Now, it's fascinating for the nerd engineer in me, but it also has room for efficiency improvements.
So, I guess the natural follow up to that question is like, for your next mission, it's not going to take 8 months to land, I assume.
I don't tempt the launch gods with statements like that.
Okay.
But it should not take quite as long. We know what we're doing now. We understand it way better. It's been burned into our brains. I can recite all the subparts of Part 450 basically to the word now, and I think about 4 or 5 other people at Varda can as well. And it's going to be a good one.
So I have some good news to talk about. You guys just recently announced a $90 million Series B round. So amazing stuff. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
So tell us a little bit about the round and what are you using the money for?
Yeah, so we were super thrilled to see that on the sort of heels of this first successful mission, as well as the significant customer traction that we've seen, both with pharmaceutical customers and general government, DoD plus civil space customers, that investors recognize basically the long-term potential of what we're working on, and so we're excited to basically use the proceeds of this financing to transition from what ultimately was an original basically demonstration mission now into higher cadence of flights and continued improvement of basically the capabilities that we offer to customers. Bruey touched on, the sort of core IP and technology that we're developing is that sort of pharmaceutical, sort of processing capabilities. This first mission was very limited, right? We took a single, basically, pharmaceutical product. We ran it through a very limited set of regimes and zones. We did no, sort of mixing, while up in orbit. Obviously, all of that we need to significantly, sort of expand, over time. And so we're super thrilled that investors, believe in that, sort of potential, and excited for what we're going to be able to, go accomplish with this, where we can transition from flying, like I mentioned, our in-house products to instead, sort of flying customer product on board.
So I know right now a lot of the commercial traction, and of course the vision is around pharma and then hypersonics. Are there any other use cases that you guys sort of like have on the product roadmap that maybe is far ahead, but it's like you've kind of circled it and say we're going to come back to this?
In the very long term, yes. But if you rank the best products to manufacture in microgravity, the first hundreds of them are all pharmaceutical products from the North Star of Varda being, or if we had one KPI, it's cadence, move drug products faster, early and often is the way to succeed. So, and that's because, again, our customer does not care that we're going to space. So we have to abstract that away. That needs to be transparent to the customer. We have to be the best formulation provider that we can be. And we don't get bonus points for going to space. So shipping to space has to be just shipping in order for us to be successful. And that's what a lot of these proceeds will go to. But as far as products go, we'll be in the pharmaceutical industry probably for the next decade.
There might be shorter term things on the sort of government front where as we continue to serve the pharmaceutical customers, there may be architecture or products that we're building to serve our pharmaceutical customer that the government may find interesting. But yeah, commercially, we're a pharmaceutical company for a very, very long time.
All right. Well, you answered my next question, which is what does Varda look like in 10 years? But it sounds like a pharma company. What do you think of space stations? Like, there's obviously a number of companies out there raising a lot of money to pursue commercial space stations and ability for humans to actually do R&D, science, manufacturing, exploration on an orbital platform. How do you guys think about space stations?
I think about it in terms of throughput and cadence, because we not only need to ship product, being drug formulas, we also need to iterate on them. So in the same way that you would run a crystallizer here on the ground in a formulation lab and change the temperature profile to better optimize for the output drug that eventually goes into the patient. You got to do that in gravity or in microgravity as well. And so the atomic unit of, if you will, is a small batch, and it's luckily about the size of our capsule. So if you imagine like a Thermo Fisher device or a crystallizer in a typical formulation lab, where you want to look like the exact same thing, but just with a gravity off switch on it. So we want to be able to run that machine as often as any other crystallizer, and we want to do it in as much of an automated way as any other crystallizer machine on the ground, because they don't want to have manual operations, pipetting, and things of that nature. So, going back to what Delian said, I think is how I think about it, where in the near term, the pharmaceutical products and the formulation opportunities that we have do not require human intervention. That being said, as launch costs continue to drop and our scale goes up, and you get this kind of cool positive feedback flywheel. And what I mean by that is we make money. The more we launch, or the more we go to space and back, the more money we make. And that's actually we're one of the only satellite companies that can say that, because most satellite companies treat their spacecraft as capital assets. We treat ours as operational expenses. So everyone else, after their constellation is populated, they can no longer say the more we launch, the more money we make, because we're already saturating direct TV channels or whatever. For us, the market on the ground is so huge that we can just continuously, it's a consumable product. And so what's neat is that as we go to space and formulate and come back more and more, our costs drop because of economies of scale, which means now the threshold for kilograms per dollar that needs to be hit for a drug formula to warrant going to microgravity also goes down, which means we can launch more, which means the threshold goes down. You get this positive feedback flywheel that drives our costs into the ground and the number of drug products we can make up. And once we get to the next kind of inflection point threshold where, a human is now warranted to go to space because the costs are low enough to put them there and the value is high enough, then, I think that's really where, if Varda ever makes a paradigm shift, it will be when we put the first working class human in space and they come down with more money than it costs to put them up there because of the drugs that they manufactured. And when we hit that precipice, then we literally have an economic demand, not only for launch that Varda has now, but an economic demand for pushing humans off of Earth.
And I think, generally we want to see these human-rated, stations succeed, given that we want to see that development, happen in parallel while we're so focused on our commercialization. But I think our argument would be a lot of the, business models that at least we've seen have been a bit of the, putting the, cart before the horse, where, they're building platforms with the hope that other people will utilize them without actually closing their own, business cases first. And so I think as we, think of what does the, post-ISS world look like, I hope to see a little bit of a return to rationality where it's seen more as, ultimately right now, the reasons we have humans in orbit is less because they're necessary for this type of scientific work or production or anything like that, but because of national pride. And it's a fine thing to actually, justify, but let's just admit that, rather than trying to invent these, business cases where, hey, we're going to be this platform where many people come and do their work, et cetera. And that's just not the case. If you're a pharmaceutical company, why would you go to a place where there's a bunch of humans so you can't bring organic solvents or acids on board, and it's higher cost and lower cadence relative to an autonomous platform, right? And so I think it's just important that in order for these companies that are working on these human space stations to succeed, they just need to be intellectually honest about where their potential is.
So, are there any upcoming milestones over the next year that investors, enthusiasts, fans, listeners should be watching out for, paying attention to for you guys?
I think other than the, more capsules, more payloads, more pharma in space and back. So we definitely want to increase our cadence. Like I said, every launch or every operation we would do, we want to be less time than it was the previous one. As long as we continue to shrink that, the company will be successful. So definitely more reentry videos, definitely more pharma products hitting the lab. The big thing I would keep an eye out for at Varda beyond the faster execution is seeing the capability that microgravity has on the patient, because microgravity is such a broad aspect. It's almost as broad as temperature, right? So temperature can make drug products good. It can also make it bad if you burn them, for example. So, and so it's the idea is obvious from a science and a physics perspective, but it's going to start to really hit home when you see specific applications from microgravity be applied to patient value. So, I was talking about Keytruda earlier, where you can get where you could put it through a shot instead of an IV bag. That's just one example. Another one Delian mentioned was we can manufacture one chemical entity we're looking at in microgravity would allow us to not have to have humidity control during manufacture. Now, those are two completely different value propositions for microgravity. One is a lower cost for the patient. The other one is a better patient experience. And so what I'm most excited about over the next year or two is tying this very broad, awesome, revolutionary aspect of Varda to the very specific value that's being created for someone else, here on Earth. And it's kind of neat because, I got into this business for the spacecraft engineering for sure. But it's a really cool side effect, no pun intended, that, what we're doing actually really, really helps people. And I almost feel ingenuine saying that because everyone knows I'm here for the space first. But it's like, oh, it's really cool to see like this product is going to, when I went to the preliminary design review for the next pharmaceutical payload that we're developing, I was thinking to myself, I was like, wow, this is like the first rudimentary prototype of a machine that will save someone's life. And that is not something you really see in the aerospace industry. And it was kind of like a moment of taken back for the space nerd that had never really been motivated by something like that before. So that's what I'm looking forward to over the next year or two.
So I have one last question for each of you, two separate questions. So you guys aren't allowed to answer each other's questions. So Bruey, your question is, you're obviously, you grew up in the SpaceX community. Any other companies that, maybe your friends, your colleagues are starting that you're particularly excited about, that you're paying attention to?
Oh, well, I'm super excited about Radiant Nuclear. Especially because there's not a great nuclear community yet. I would really hope that someone builds a community around nuclear energy because I mean it's obviously the best near-term solution for climate change, which is also a passion of mine. And so, if only we could get like a consensus around how we can do this safely and a community all kind of to exchange this village of ideas. I think Radiant is really cool. That's one that's nearby here in El Segundo as well. K2 is a cool one because they're making large satellites that are that also take advantage of the new launch paradigms that similar to the we are. I love working with Rocket Lab, our partners for building some of our satellite buses. That's not quite the startup community but wouldn't feel right without saying that. Ground station companies are coming online, like Northwood. We're excited to buy from them. So it's really cool that this ecosystem is coming up that takes advantage of a new paradigm, essentially, of space access.
Well, I only wanted one, but you gave me four, so I'll accept it. And I appreciate the hat tip to Ignition. I'll send you that Venmo payment that I mentioned earlier. Delian, so your question. Okay, so we didn't really talk about this, but obviously you do spend some time over at Founders Fund throwing checks at different companies,
including some of the ones that Bruey mentioned.
Including some, exactly. My question for you is: you have one last space investment to make, and you can never invest in a space company again. You have two choices. You can either invest in a current company, or I'll say sector. I won't have you pick out a company, but a subsector. Or you can wait and put your dollar on something that doesn't exist yet, but you have to identify what that is today. Where would it be?
That's a good question. I mean, if I can choose the year and sort of timing, I guess it's like, I mean, I'd love to be, the first person, in some ways, if you look at Varda's business model, say again?
Does it have to be space?
Oh, I assume it has to be space, right?
Yeah, it has to be space because it's one more space.
It has to be space.
It's one last space investment.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Yeah. I think it's like, if you look at, sort of Varda, that people had attempted this business model in 2010, 12, 14, 16, et cetera, but it was just slightly the wrong, sort of time. Maybe the, answer that I'd give is by 2028, 29, I'm sure SpaceX will have figured out sort of lunar Starship. And about a year before that is when I'm sure the best, basically like lunar ice mining operation is going to get started. Because the ones that are like starting today might be a little too early to the game, and they might like lose their sort of momentum. And so probably 3 or 4 years from today is the right time to invest in like lunar ice mining.
All right, we'll come back to that. I'm going to pencil you in to come back on the show in a few years.
Yeah, maybe I'll have a seed investment at that point. That's a killer team of people doing it.
All right, there you go. Well, guys, thank you so much for being on the show. This is great. Pleasure. Congratulations on all the success, and excited to see the next mission.
Thanks so much for having us, Mo. Cheers.
Yeah, thanks, Mo. Have a good one.